Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Crom Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassel.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it. Michael, here we are. It is March 28th. We do this each week. We want to give the date because so much has happened.
2025, I usually have to add.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. And I want to talk about two or three themes today. And I want to start with this movie that you and I are both familiar with that I really encourage people who have not seen it, especially if they're younger, and younger than me is really easy. Younger than you is mostly easy. But it's a movie called Thelma and Louise, because the metaphor at the end of the movie, as the two ladies are driving their beautiful convertible car at an accelerating speed toward a 5,000-foot cliff, is kind of the fiscal situation where the United States finds itself today.
It's a good metaphor.
Yeah, and right now we're some hundreds of yards away from the cliff, and we do have an opportunity to either slow the car down and stop it, or to turn it, and maybe even stop it and go back the other direction.
What would you say to a critic who said this is Chicken Little thinking? The sky is falling, and that we're predicting something that's not likely to happen.
Okay, that's a good question. I would use history. And if you go back 250 years, which is not all that long ago, and I can even use examples in the last 250 years, but if I go back before then, every single government in the history of the world prior to that period at one point or another collapsed. Every one. And then the question is, why do governments collapse? And it's almost always fiscal. Almost always. And so there's also a term, Michael, that you and I think have used, but if not, we're going to, and that is the exception and the rule. And if you're going to apply logic, you want to apply logic based on the rule, not based on the exception.
Right.
And so even if somebody could find an example of a government that collapsed for a reason other than fiscal.
So let's talk about what fiscal means, because this may not be a common word that's all that familiar to some of our listeners.
Please.
It has to do with economics and your financial wherewithal, right? This has to do with the integrity of your money, your capacity to pay your bills, et cetera.
Yeah.
Right? And so fiscal is the economic side of government management.
Yeah. And where we are, thank you. And where we are today is we have a $36 trillion federal deficit, which is up something in the neighborhood of $20 trillion in the last 12 years.
So up, did you say 36 or 37?
Yeah, 36, it's 36.2.
Okay, so it's gone from 16.2 to 36.2 in a relatively short period of time.
Okay, so that's $20 trillion. And you know, none of us can understand what $1 trillion is, right, much less 20 trillion.
Yes.
But if you break it down on a per household basis and understand the effects of it, because the way that I like to describe, I think is the most accurate way to describe how the deficit affects the average person, is that the total amount of debt service is now a little over $1 trillion. It's like $1.1 trillion just to service the debt.
Service it is just paying the interest on it.
Just paying the interest.
To keep it going, and you still owe the principal.
Still owe the principal, but the servicing cost is what impacts, I believe, it impacts every household equally in terms of the financial part, not relatively, but actually equally. And so deficits affect lower income people much more than deficits affect higher income people. And so federal deficits, if there's a point at which we lose control of our money, inflation becomes so great that there will be fundamental changes that are required just by the fact that there is no other alternative.
People can't pay their bills.
And the government can't either, and the money's not worth anything. And so that's where we are today. And what you have is you have a situation where you've just had an election in November, And this gets into also discussing our constitutional Republican form of government was designed so that the people actually had a say in the government. And if you go back and read the Federalist Papers and you read the various thinkers, political thinkers, the theory was that candidates would run for office, and they would tell the voters what they intended to do if elected, and then they really were morally obligated, but not legally obligated. They were morally obligated to then do what they said they would do, and thereby the voters were in control of the country, we the people, and that the government was a servant of the people. So that was kind of the theory. Well, now you have Trump, who got elected on running on a very, very clear agenda. He wanted to have mass deportation, for example. He's not invoked that in the way that he said he would initially. He's now going after essentially criminals, but even going after criminals is
fiercely resisted.
Is fiercely resisted by his political opponents, and they can't do it with politicians because they don't have the power. So they're going to the judiciary, and certain judges are issuing nationwide injunctions. Now, here's something that's interesting. When George Bush was president, the judiciary issued 6 nationwide injunctions.
Let's say what an injunction is.
Okay. It's when a judge in a district, and there's like 700 judges, and I don't know how many hundreds of districts, but districts are small. Nashville, Tennessee, for example, has a district.
Right.
But this is where a federal judge in a district is presented a case and then makes a ruling and says, my ruling not only applies to this district, it applies to the entire country.
I have a friend who's a federal judge, and I've asked him about this. And he said, normally a judge is faced with a dispute between the parties to the lawsuit, and you decide for or against the parties involved. It's for those people, and it's in this particular area. What you've described is they may say this applies to other people in this area, but that's the scope of that judge's purview in that, and it gets appealed if it deals with their area. What you're now saying is that these judges are taking these disputes between two litigants, the offense and the defense, for lack of a better term, to put it in simple sports terms, and they're saying this applies to everybody across the country.
Right. And not only that, if the activity that's in question is in, say, the state of Texas, the plaintiffs are suing in a district that has nothing to do with Texas, but they believe that they can get a judge who will rule in their favor.
Yes.
And so this is how it's being applied. And so
an example of that, and it's actually kind of relevant to COVID. Let's say litigants come before, and one guy says, I can't pay my rent. And he's sued by the landlord, says, you've got to pay me because I got to pay the bank. And if you don't pay me, I can't stay in business and I'll go bankrupt. So the equivalent here is that a judge would say, not only do you not have to pay this landlord, nobody in the country has to pay their landlords.
Right.
Which is what Biden said.
So here's where we are. And so, but I wanted to help our listeners and viewers understand the situation now versus the relatively recent past. When Bush was president for 8 years, judges had nationwide injunctions 6 times. When Obama was president for 8 years, it was 12 times. When Trump was president the first time, just for 4 years, it was 65 times. No telling how many nationwide injunctions will be issued in Trump's second term. And so this gets to the very heart of the way our system works. Our constitutional republic, for it to function, requires voters to have when they vote, they should have a expectation that the people that they elect are allowed to carry out the desires of the voters. And what you're seeing now is you're seeing judges who are saying over and over and over again, issue after issue after issue. Now, will the Supreme Court likely overturn a number of those decisions eventually? And the answer is yes. But what you're seeing, in my opinion, you're seeing judges who are becoming far more political. When John Roberts had been nominated for Chief Justice and he was holding his hearings, he was asked the role of a judge. He said the role of a judge is similar to that of a umpire or a referee in the game. It is to enforce the rules, not interpret and make up new rules during the game, but to enforce the rules and apply them equally to both sides of the contest. That's what judges should do.
Well, there's a critical point here that the judges get to say whether someone's following the law. I would submit to you that under Biden, he was not following the law when he issued a nationwide hold on rents.
Correct.
He didn't have the power to do that. And a judge said that pretty quickly and it went away. He forgave student loan debts, massive amounts of student loan debts. He didn't have the authority to do that by himself. So there's the argument about what does the president have the authority to do. We're having plenty of those arguments now. Mm-hmm. Trump is challenging that. He is accountable to the law, which is, on the favor of the side, people that are resisting this, what is the law? And there'll be a lot of tests. But the other point you're making is the degree to which the judiciary becomes an active participant in the political process because they don't like what that guy is doing, and then they will claim it's against the law, and maybe it's not.
Yeah, and in some cases, for example, I read a recent article where in October of 2022, the Biden administration, there was a lot of problems at the border in terms of there were so many people trying to come across the border, and there's a special part of our immigration law that allows people to apply for certain kinds of asylum, and that's supposed to be pretty limited. That's it, up until
it's for
Biden.
Protection from prosecution in your home country, where you're going to be killed if you go back.
Yes, and so you could apply for that. And some did, and it was a relatively small number. And Biden decided that asylum could be applied for by anybody, more or less. You just had to have a sponsor who would then sponsor you, and he made it very simple. He would then bring 30,000 asylum seekers into the United States every month by plane. So they flew them in.
So they didn't even go past the border checkpoints. They just went directly internal.
And your application was filled out in your home country, and then you got on a plane and got a free plane ticket, and it flew you in to one of dozens of airports across the country.
Is there any known reason why someone would do this? It sounds so absurd to me, and so illegal. I'm not a lawyer. Maybe it's permissible. Maybe he's just pushing the boundaries of what he's authorized to do.
Well, judges allowed it. Yeah. So it wasn't by the same judges or the same institution. The judiciary said that's legal because the president has that authority.
Okay.
Their argument was the president had that authority. That's what they ruled. And so Biden did that. And so in they come in August of 2024, before the election, the Biden administration stopped doing it and said, we have found that there's widespread fraud in the application process, that many of the sponsors are making claims that are false. Who knew? And so they stopped doing it in August before the election. Some cynical people, apparently think that he stopped it before the election because immigration was the number one election issue, and he was trying to remove that from the table as an issue. Some people think that. But now you have Trump who is saying, okay, there are criminals amongst us. Criminals. I mean, these are gang people who are murderers, rapists, thieves. They're terrible. It's a shame that they are as terrible as they are. But they're members of gangs. They have a code of ethics that is anti-law. And so Trump is now rounding them up, and he is now saying, as president, I have the right to send them outside the country, either back to their own country or if they're criminals, to a prison in El Salvador. And the same institution that said that a president had the authority to allow illegal immigrants to come into the country under a particular pretense, says as the same institution saying that a president,
which is the judiciary,
yes,
it's a different judge, but the same branch of government is now saying you can't take them out. You can bring them in. I'm going to let him bring them in, but I'm not going to let you take them out.
Yeah. The question is, when you have this is where you get into this question of equal treatment under the law.
Yeah.
So if the judiciary becomes truly politicized, and Schumer said something, who's a leading Democrat in the Senate. He said something the other day. He was very proud of the fact, and the way he described it was breathtaking. He said, in the last year, we're very proud of the fact that we confirmed 230 progressive judges. So he didn't say judges; they're progressive judges. So apparently they are expected to rule in a way that the Democrat Party wants them to rule, which is the opposite of what the role of an umpire or a referee is in a sporting event. And so that's that'll be something that we have to watch. So we've kind of talked about what is the role of Congress in this, and actually we haven't talked about that, because Congress now, under our Constitution, it's interesting because I did not know this. I had a thought of what I thought our Constitution said in Article 3, which is about the judiciary, mm-hmm. and I did not understand it correctly. So I pulled it out. Somebody said, well, that's not right. So I pulled it out, and I read it, and lo and behold, I misunderstood it. And it's always interesting when you learn.
What did you misunderstand?
Here's what I misunderstood. I thought that the lower courts reported to the Supreme Court. I thought the Supreme Court could discipline a lower court judge, could admonish them, could take away their powers, could do different things if the Supreme Court said, you are regularly ruling against the law. You don't have the authority to change the law at that level. You're ruling against the law. If you continue to do this, we're going to remove you. The Supreme Court has no authority over the lower courts. The Constitution says that that there will be a Supreme Court right there, and that it will do such and such. All such lower courts will be ordained and established by Congress. And so the Congress determines whether or not there are lower courts at all,
right? And
which lower courts will exist. And so this Congress could, during the budget process, I think it could eliminate, if it chose to, it could eliminate certain districts altogether.
There's an interesting theme of accountability here because as the Federalist Papers articulated so well, and as we covered in our Giants of Political Thought, the Congress is the most sensitive branch of government. The House of Representatives, the most sensitive of the two bodies in Congress, right? The Senate is elected on 6-year terms, 2-year turnover, a third every 2 years. And so it's intended to be cooling down, longer term, wiser, cooler heads will prevail sort of idea. And the whole House is elected every 2 years, all 435 of them. And so it's intended to be the most sensitive to public opinion and the most responsive and accountable to public opinion. Mm-hmm. Judiciary is not supposed to be accountable to public opinion at all. So people wandering around in front of the Supreme Court with their placards, they may have some effect. I mean, there's an effect of public opinion, but conceptually, the judges are not supposed to pay attention to that. They're supposed to apply the law.
Right. And so we're at a situation now where we'll be watching over the next few months because the Thelma and Louise, I mean, we, the voters and everybody, we're still heading right now. We're heading toward the cliff, and the actual speed has not really slowed down. And there's a lot of activity going on to try to slow it down and maybe even to try to turn it so that it averts disaster. But everything that DOJ is doing is being challenged at the court level. Much of what DOJ is doing, and then the president is signing an executive order because Elon Musk doesn't have the authority to do anything. Elon Musk is only being given the authority to essentially do an investigation, analyze what he finds, and make recommendations to Trump or to the cabinet members.
When we see in the press that DOJ has canceled such and such contracts and fired so many people, what does that really mean?
Well, that would not be accurate. Yes. I mean, it's not the most accurate way of saying exactly what happened, because Elon Musk simply finds something and he reports what he finds to the secretaries or to the president, and then they act. They're the ones who actually act.
Yeah, that was the answer I'm looking for.
Yeah.
But it's misrepresented in the press because it's a way of undermining what they're trying to do.
Right. But what they're finding, this is what's interesting, and so So I want to get to a theme here about using the word inherent. Government is inherently inefficient. It is at least inherently inefficient. It also can lead toward corruption on a massive scale. The private sector, on the other hand, is inherently efficient because it has to be. If you are a participant in the private sector and you are inefficient, you will either have to charge more money to your customers than your competition, in which case the customers will buy from your competition, or you'll go out of business. So you have to be attempting in the private sector to be efficient. That doesn't mean everybody is. That's why there are businesses that go out of business.
There are corrupt practices in business. Sometimes companies are so big and they're so insulated from reasonable competition that it might take them 10 or 20 years to lose their market. Mm-hmm. But the market eventually will undermine somebody that is that inefficient.
Well, and let me say this. You make a very good point there, because if you are in an industry that is highly regulated by the government, then you do not have to be efficient.
Yes.
You simply don't have to be, because the government is going to be there to backstop you on your inefficiencies.
Well, the way I would put that is the government has no competition.
Correct.
Okay, if there needs to be more money, they just ask for more money.
Correct.
This is what we see again and again with schools and healthcare. Don't have enough, we need more, and there's a ratchet that keeps turning up the spending, and there's no limiting mechanism on that you have in the private sector.
Right.
Let me add a point here. When we started Knowledge Products, you may remember there was a guy we both were fond of named Ludwig von Mises.
Yes.
He was an economist of what's called the Austrian school, which is very pro-market. We met his widow, if you remember that, when we were starting the business. Very interesting. Now, he is a cult figure among some people because of the thinking that he had. His writing is almost impenetrable. I don't recommend reading it, but I did read one of his books called Bureaucracy. He makes a very simple point.
That was a good book.
It's a great book. He makes a very simple point that's specifically about what we're talking about now. In business, you have to take 100 cents or $100 or $100 million, and you've got to make it worth 110 or 120. That's a profit motive, or you're out of business, right? If your costs are more than your revenues, eventually you're going out of business, period.
That's correct.
Okay. In the public sector, that is not true. You take $100 or $1,000 or $100 billion or $1 trillion, and you spend some of it to administer it, and the rest of it goes to the purpose. Right. This is Karl Marx's mistake. He thought that this is the way the private sector operated. You had a bunch of leeches at the top named capitalists who were sucking off the profits and leaving some for the laborers who really did the work. So he saw this as a kind of structure that takes away from the revenue that belongs to somebody else.
And Karl Marx was correct if the industry that he was looking at was protected by the government. Because
yes,
then
they behave more like the public sector.
Yes, and they did abuse labor.
Yeah.
To the benefit of themselves because they could, because there were no ramifications for doing so.
The point I'm trying to make is that the profit motive is the essential mechanism that makes businesses efficient.
Yeah, and not only that. Let's talk. We're going to digress just a bit because you're on a very good point here, and I'm going to make a statement that is, once again, this is the exception and the rule. This is going to be the rule. In a competitive marketplace, businesses increase their profits by figuring out less expensive ways to provide for the same or a better quality product. So in other words, they lower their prices by figuring out how to do things in a more efficient way. Now, the other thing is that if you are a company that is capital intensive, the profits that you're making are needed to expand the business. Because if you don't have profits to expand the business, you literally cannot expand the business. And so there are lots of businesses like retailers or restaurant chains or anything where the business grows by location and where they have to stock the stores with either equipment or with inventory to sell.
So if you're an unprofitable business, you're like a government or a nonprofit company, meaning you are dependent on investors or contributors or somebody that subsidizes an activity that's not paying for itself.
Correct.
And business has to pay for itself, and it has to pay for itself in two ways. Let's make this point. Not only do you have to make a profit for your investors, right, and pay for your expenses and leave them a profit at the end. And people who invest in retirement accounts, they want a return on it. They want to live off the return on that investment, so it has to be positive. But you also have to make an improvement for your customer. You've got to make it more efficient for him to spend his money with you than to do something else.
Right.
So you've got to improve their lives by some reasonable margin that motivates them to be your customer. And then you've got to increase the value enough to pay yourself and to pay back your investors.
Yeah.
Those are powerful motives to drive innovation and efficiency.
Yeah.
Constantly looking for ways to do that better. Government does not have that mechanism.
Right. And if you look at any major industry over a period of time, you can see those things. Like if you look at communication and where communication started and where it is now. Back, we
talk about phones and
talk about phones, talk about books, talking about sending information. All the costs of doing those things have dropped dramatically, and in some cases dropped to nearly a marginal cost of zero.
Well, even in the last few decades, you used to have to put things on media like cassettes, CD. We've talked about this before on this podcast. It was very expensive, and now it costs pennies to what used to spend dollars. Right.
And so, therefore, we've been able to lower the selling price of our product to our customers at the giantsofpoliticalthought.com. We now offer the same content on a streaming basis that we sold on cassettes at $14.95, and that was 40 years ago.
So that was per title for 13 titles. So that's about almost $200 40 years ago, which is probably $500 or $600 in equivalent money today.
Right, which
now
we
it's
sell
under
for
$100.
Under $100.
Yeah.
So now on the Doge, I want to pull up the. I want to talk about a particular issue that is impacting all of this discussion about budgets and everything else. And that is, this one chart here is fascinating to me, and I think we may have used it before, but I want to focus on it. What this shows in 1990, you had about 23 million people were on Medicaid. Now let's talk about what Medicaid was what it was designed to do. And Medicaid was a health care policy set up by the federal government, passed into law by the federal government, where the federal government would contribute approximately $2 to help pay for health care for lower income people, and then a state where that person lived would pay $1. So it was kind of a 2-to-1 matching.
So this is for people at the poverty level. When you say lower income, it was basically for impoverished people.
Poverty or slightly above.
Okay.
In other words, it was for lower income working people, right, or people who didn't have a job and were on welfare.
And that would be typically what percentage of the population?
Back in those days, it was about 20%.
Okay.
Okay. And in fact, it might have even been less than that at the beginning, because it would have been less than that in 1990. It probably would have been maybe 15%. Now, the rate of poverty has not really changed. If you say what percentage of the American population lives in poverty, the percentage hasn't changed much since 1990. But look at what the numbers have done.
But it's a relative measurement. People that are now considered impoverished have carpet in their homes, they have air conditioning, they have cars, they probably have a cell phone, and they still may qualify as impoverished. My point is, it's a relative term. It's a percentage of people relative to the norm, but we've become so much more prosperous that even the poorest live better.
But what I'm saying is that Medicaid has now become an entitlement that many middle income people are now availing themselves of. And I want to talk about why.
Yeah, this is part of the same point. The people may have large screen TVs, but they're on Medicaid.
Right, but they're not impoverished.
Right.
In other words, the program was originally designed to help people who needed the help.
Right.
And it has become a program that is helping people who we didn't think would need the help. And I want to get into why, because that's a key point here. Because so what happened is it got up to 100 million people, which is just a little. That's about 30% of the population of the country. Now, since then, it's dropped a little bit because that was at the height of COVID,
Right.
and there were some particular so-called COVID
Distortions, people out of work and things like that.
Yeah. But the general idea. But here's what I've looked at: health insurance under Obamacare, and this is where Medicaid and Obamacare both started to go up dramatically. Obamacare requires a person to have insurance. Requires them to have insurance. Now, if they work in the private sector, the cost of insurance now is about $2,000 a family, okay, a month, $2,000 a month. And there's still high deductibles and there's still copays. Now,
meaning you're not done when you pay the $2,000, you still got to pay a lot more beyond that. So
yes.
That's $24,000 a year.
Yes.
Plus the copays and all that's probably $35,000 a year that you end up for a family.
Right. And so if you actually need to access the healthcare system, you're going to be paying that. You're going to be paying the deductible and copay up to probably about $30,000. Okay, so you got but the insurance is you have to pay that insurance.
Whether you're
Somebody
sick or
has
not.
to pay it, whether you're sick or not, and you're required to do it. And this is the key: is that if I say you have a 2-income family and they're each making $40,000 a year, which is below the average income. Average income is about $55,000, but that's below average income. But if you get 2 people who are married and they're each making $40,000, that's $80,000 for that household, and so that sounds like a livable amount of money.
Is this before tax?
No, it's before tax.
Okay.
But the tax isn't the issue here. The issue is that they're required to buy health care. And so now all of a sudden that $80,000 has a $30,000 health care cost associated with it. $24,000 of it impacts them whether they access the system or not. So that acts as a giant tax, a much bigger tax than the income tax or the Social Security tax or the Medicare tax. And this is the key. So how do people now, how are they now adjusting to the reality that insurance costs are going through the roof? When Obama was president, one of the things that he promised Obamacare would do is it would save the average family $2,500 a year. Mm-hmm. It's cost them $12,000 more. And that $12,000 is what I want to talk about here because...
Can I tell one story
here?
Sure,
yes, please.
I went to a speech by one of Obama's main advisors. I can't remember his name, but he was his main campaign advisor. He's from Chicago, wears black rimmed glasses. Seemed like a decent fellow, but he was almost crying when describing the feeling that they had when they passed Obamacare because people could now get health care that couldn't before. Right, that's the perception on the left of what Obamacare did. Mm-hmm. I have a close friend who's a musician here in Nashville. He has to buy his own insurance, and he was livid when Obamacare passed. Not only did it make it more expensive, he lost his insurance. They just basically said, "We're not covering you. Go find somebody else."
Right.
And when he did find somebody else, his insurance went up in the same way that you're describing in the private sector.
Right. And so this gets so this
they were regulated and they had to.
Yes, yeah, and there were many things that Obamacare required insurance companies to offer,
right?
That they then had to include in the premiums.
They were bundled in there, whether you thought you needed it or not.
Yeah. So, for example, if you were a single man, your insurance you had to pay for a baby,
right?
And so and you had to include mental health. Even if you never wanted to see a psychiatrist, you were forced to buy it. And so insurance premiums have gone up $1,000 a month in the last 10 years, $1,000 a month. And so, but incomes haven't. Taxes have gone up, Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes, all of these taxes have gone up. Then you have inflation that you've had. And so how have people reacted when you are forced to pay a very, very large amount for insurance, or you have a choice? You can apply for and get on Medicaid. And Medicaid is essentially free. Now, the product is not great, but it's not bad. And the hospitals are the same. And so what's happening is, and now the car we're in heading to the cliff is now accelerating because there's a whole lot more people who are now being forced by very bad policy to avail them. Now, and by the way, this is a policy which is filled with good intentions, because as you pointed out, the people who passed Obamacare were looking at one aspect of Obamacare, and it would help a few million people, which is not a small number,
right,
but it would help a few million people be able to buy insurance on a subsidized basis. By the way, this is not including Obamacare. This is just Medicaid. There are other people who avail themselves of Obamacare, which is also highly subsidized by the taxpayer, which is what's driving our deficit higher and higher and higher.
There's a demographic point to make here, which is that the baby boomers have recently begun entering retirement.
Mm-hmm.
This is a generation from after World War II. I think it ended in 1965. But the first of the baby boomers, let's say 1950, just to make, they're now 75.
Mm-hmm.
They've been retired for 5 or 10 years. They're going to live probably 5 or 10 years more. You have another decades of people coming into it who are living long lifespans. The demographics are going to make this worse because they're high users of healthcare.
Yes, well, yes, but so I wanted to just read, if I could. This is really quite something. Just some headlines on healthcare, and then talk about the implications of them. This is a headline: America's healthcare is broken enough. We don't need bad journalists making it worse. Now, what we're talking about here, the theme here, I am not going to propose that people go without healthcare. That's not what I'm proposing. What I'm going to suggest is that the healthcare system, the way it is organized by law today, is more than twice as expensive as what healthcare costs would naturally be if the market were allowed to function. We do not have a market-driven healthcare system. We have a system that is determined and controlled. The policies are controlled entirely by the government. And Michael, we've talked about this before, and I want to introduce the concept here once again, and that is the question of, when we say, who is the customer? What defines, in general terms, what defines the customer?
Who pays?
Who pays? And government pays 70% of our health care now is paid for to the providers through various programs and insurance companies. The government is the customer.
And so they're accountable to the customer. They're not accountable to the user so much. And now the doctors want to make their patients happy because they can go somewhere else, but the patient's not paying them. Sometimes they don't care whether the patient's happy. That's not their primary motivation. They want to get paid and stay in business.
And more doctors now, because of the way that the healthcare system works, more and more doctors now work for large organizations, and they are told how to administer healthcare. They were told how to administer COVID.
How many patients they have to see in an hour.
They're told all these different things. And so I'm going to push back on what you said just a moment ago. Doctors might like to have their patients be happy, but that's not what motivates them, unfortunately.
I have a good relationship with my doctor, and I think he cares about me, and I think that's what I was trying to say. They still care about people, but they're in a system that drives them to be primarily accountable to somebody else.
Yes. And I would imagine there are lots of physicians today who are part of a corporate organization who, the way they administer, they may want you to be healthy, and they may be nice people. In fact, I'm sure they are nice people, and they're well educated. But what motivates them and what determines what they do is not determined by the doctor-patient relationship. It's by the government-doctor relationship or the organization that can be attacked by the government on a moment's notice. And so let me just read another one here. Reform of Medicaid's flawed funding formula. And what this article talks about, how because the federal government contributes $2 for every $1 that a state spends, what you have now is you have state after state after state gaming the system by imposing taxes on the healthcare providers and then doubling the reimbursement to those very same providers.
So the providers like it. They're happy to
pay,
go along with that.
They're happy to pay the $1 in tax and get $2 more in reimbursement because the money the $2 is actually coming from the federal government.
Right.
And that's what's driving the deficit higher. The next one, taxpayers spent billions covering same Medicaid patient twice. And in some cases, they find them 5 times. Here's what happens. A person on Medicaid moves from one state to the next, signs up under Medicaid in the new state. They haven't been dropped from the old state. So when they go in for care, the Medicaid pays twice. It pays to their old provider who didn't even see them, and it pays the new provider because the systems don't talk to each other.
Right.
And this is what Elon Musk is talking about. And that is that our systems don't talk to each other. There were thousands and thousands of COVID applications for money for people who are under 11 years old. Now, the people who are under 11 years old didn't apply, but their parents probably did. But the COVID, the IRS system that administered the COVID distributions to people who applied didn't talk to the Social Security system to determine
how old
age,
they were,
how old
if
they
they're
were,
still alive, et cetera.
And this is what Elon Musk is. When he really gets into it, he's saying our systems at the national level are so archaic that
old.
Yes, they are old. Well, yes, they're old but
outdated, incompetent.
Yeah, and there's not a. And this gets, if you are in the private sector, and you let your systems become outdated to that extent, you would go out of business.
Right.
And so there's a natural cleansing process. But in the public sector, it actually means that there are more employees that are needed to run a program because the systems are so inherently inefficient because they're so old.
Right.
And so that'd be another one. And then here's another one here, another headline. And these are all, by the way, within the last 2 or 3 weeks. Medicaid insures millions of Americans. How the healthcare program works in its charts. Well, that may be what we're talking about here. Yeah, it is. And so what we have is that the Medicaid system itself, and they're talking about how between Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare, you're now approaching $2.5 trillion in federal spending if you put it all in together, and we're now spending as a nation $5 trillion, and so we'll be talking about this in future podcasts because healthcare reform is possible with huge savings without diminishing the quality of care to the patient, because it is the third-party payment system itself that is absorbing 60% of the total cost. Now, do you need some system in there? Yes. But as we've talked about in the private sector, it generally is 2 to 3%, not 60%. Yeah.
Some people think that the solution to this is a single payer. Right, so you don't have all this cost of third-party adjudication and all the administration that goes on to get a claim processed and a payment back, and you just have one guy pay the bill. Isn't that more efficient?
Well,
I know the answer, but I'm goading you here that this is the way some people want to go to solve this problem of third-party inefficiency.
Well, what happens is that's a little bit like saying that wouldn't it be better if the government, because it truly would be, wouldn't it be better if the government just ran health care? Let's look at 2 countries that have gone to a single payer system and talk about it. One is Canada and the other is Great Britain. Now, Great Britain went to a single payer system decades ago, and they found that the quality became so bad and the demands became so much higher.
Unlimited, really.
Unlimited, because if it's free and you're lonely, you'll go into the doctor's office because you want to talk to somebody.
Right.
Or the other thing is, quite frankly, and this I think is a subtle human thing. If I get free health care, do I have a strong incentive to live a healthy life? I certainly have a less strong incentive to be healthy. I would like to be healthy, but if I feel bad or I have something that happens to me that's not good because of my lifestyle, because of what I eat, what I drink, lack of exercise, all these different things, there's no impact on financially on me. So I get to go in.
We have a friend who's a healthcare economist. He was on a faculty of a business school, and he made this point by saying, "This is why I put mayonnaise on my cheese fries."
Yeah, there you go.
I don't have to pay for the consequences. When I get a heart attack, somebody else is going to pay for it.
So that would be one implication. But let's look at the other. In Canada, the ability to see a doctor on what we call a primary care physician quickly is pretty darn good. But to see a specialist or to get something done like a knee replacement or a hip replacement or even heart surgery, you have to wait in line. And so many wealthy Canadians come to Buffalo, they come to Detroit, or they come to Seattle. There are businesses in the United States that do nothing but arrange for Canadians who will pay in full on the day of service to come to the United States to get specialty treatment. And that's because in Canada they can't afford it. And their healthcare system is very expensive because anybody who wants access to healthcare can get it. And so they allow it for the day-to-day stuff. But for the more expensive specialty stuff, they simply don't offer it. And so the Canadians wait in line who can't afford to come to the U.S.
And they may wait for 6, 8, 10, 12 months.
And if they have a heart condition, they may die while they're waiting.
Right.
And so in Great Britain, what they did was they went through a few decades of what they call their National Health Institute, or whatever they call it, was single payer, and it was run by the government. The healthcare system was run by the government. And that became so unsatisfactory that they then said, okay, we're going to continue to do this, but you can pay in full or you can buy private health insurance. And so there became another industry in Great Britain that actually is much more efficient because it's completely patient driven. There is a doctor-patient relationship because people pay in full or they have insurance for the very expensive stuff. So by the way, let me just give very quickly the solution to this. So the solution is to have widespread HSAs,
health savings
accounts, so that and if you are a provider, and this can be done using.
This means it's your own money that is deducted from your income. You don't pay taxes on it, so it can accumulate, and you have it there to pay for. It's like self-insuring in a modest way.
For everything except catastrophic.
Right.
Catastrophic would be insured. It's a lot like car insurance. You have car insurance to pay for car wrecks, which are not normal, but
which are beyond most people's budget to pay. But they should be paying for their gas, for their oil, for their tires. And what we have is a system now that basically insures the equivalent of gas, oil, and tires.
Yes, or it requires that people who pay for anything in healthcare using it for the car. Anytime you do anything for your car, some third-party payment system has to know that you spent it. That is what is expensive.
Yeah.
And so the same thing is true with your homeowner's insurance. If you need a plumber, you pay for the plumber. If you need the electrician, you pay for the electrician. If you need a new HVAC system, if you didn't have private insurance for your HVAC system, which is a choice, then you have to pay for it if you need a new system. That's not cheap. But it also is not. It's not cheap. But people do pay for it. They figure out ways to pay for those things.
Carmen, in a future podcast, I want to talk about rights because there's an important background concept here that people have a right to health care. Okay. And if they think they have a right to it, that means it has to be provided even if they can't pay for it.
Okay.
And so I think this is one of the foundations of this illness that we have where people think I am entitled to that whether I can pay for it or not. We have a similar idea about education.
That's going to be the next topic.
Next topic, yeah.
So let's just finish the education the healthcare real quick.
Yes.
Just put a period on it, and that is that we're the goal of what you and I are talking about here is healthcare reform that doesn't reduce the ability of people to access the system, but it does make it much, much less expensive on the third payment side. That's where the money will come from for the Make America Healthy Again agenda. Will have to be healthcare reform. But what you're seeing now is you're seeing people who are being middle-income people who are being driven from the private insurance system because the premiums have gotten to be so ridiculously high. So let's just stop on that because the point here, the general theme here is the inherent the inherent inefficiency of government programs, even when the people, as you point out, who pass them into law think they're doing something good.
Just to reinforce something we said earlier, what you have now is a system that takes your money, processes it at some expense, gives you back part of it, and it comes with rules.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is, I think, in healthcare, even more in education. This is why they're trying to get rid of the Department of Education.
Mm-hmm.
Say, we'll just give you the money we were going to spend, 100% of it, instead of taking out 10 or 20 or 30 in administrative costs and then sending you a bunch of rules that cost you more to comply with.
Yes. So now let's switch gears to education, because if there's anything that is worse in terms of
Highly regulated industry.
in terms of giving you something for your money that's of value than healthcare, because the quality of care in the U.S. is still generally quite good. It's the cost of it that is so expensive. In education, we spend more money per student in the United States on education than any country in the world. We are near the bottom of the top of the 40 industrialized countries that we measure against in terms of outcomes. And so if you are spending a bunch of money and getting a terrible result, there's something wrong with that system, unless the students are all stupid. Well, and I don't believe the students are all stupid.
One answer that you hear a lot of times is it's the car's not working well enough to put more gas in the car so we can get there faster. You know, I had this argument with actually a pastor at my church. They had formed a school because our local public schools were not addressing dyslexia. Okay. So there's now a big school that has grown out of this for kids with special needs. But his idea was that public schools don't have enough money to do all they're demanded. We need a tax hike. We've heard this for decades in Tennessee. They need a tax hike so they can do better. And I said, Pastor, that's just putting more gas in a car that's not performing the way it should.
Right, or doubling the pay of a coach that loses all his games every year, right, and saying if I just pay the coaching staff more, the results will be better.
Do better.
Yeah. So let's scroll down, and this is Make America Smart Again, and this is Rahm Emanuel. This is about Rahm Emanuel, and he was the mayor of Chicago. And Rahm Emanuel,
he was in Obama's cabinet too, I think, wasn't he?
Yes, he was in Obama, and he's the one who says never let a crisis go to waste.
Right.
Okay. Now, so I think Rahm Emanuel is a smart guy.
I was going to say a very smart guy.
Very smart guy, but that doesn't mean that what he wants to do,
thinks is right,
what he thinks is right, or at least his methods of doing it. So let's just read the very beginning of this thing. It says, in the 7th grade, if I had known I could have said the words they. Well, excuse me. This is Rahm Emanuel trying to deflect. This is because Rahm Emanuel is trying to deflect from the fact that the schools in Chicago are so terrible, and because he's now trying to blame it on the trans issue, and that's a brand new issue. He was the mayor of Chicago, but let's go down here to those are great lines, but let's that right there. To be fair. That paragraph. To be fair, Mr. Emanuel had a reform agenda with plans for charter schools and longer school days. But in September of 2012, the Chicago Teachers Union went on strike, demanding, and this is what they do every time. Teachers Union went on strike demanding higher pay, no link between teacher pay and student performance. Mayor Emanuel wanted raises linked to layoffs, which the union rejected. So I scroll down here. All right, so some critics at the time, including Andy Kessler, the author of this, thought the then mayor shouldn't let the crisis go to waste and should channel his inner Ronald Reagan and stand up to the unions. He did not, and so he collapsed. He capitulated to the unions, and the unions got everything they wanted. They got higher pay, no accountability, greater pensions, and more bureaucracy, because the teachers' unions, their business model is the more employees there are being paid by the education system, the higher their revenue is, because they get the same amount from every member.
Yeah.
So teacher pay went up, accountability did not. The number of bureaucrats skyrocketed, and Emanuel did not get what he wanted in terms of longer days or more teaching. And the outcome turned out to be that here we have it. Scroll down here a little bit. That paragraph that says, I wondered how students entering the Chicago public school system in 2012 have done. So here we are 12 years later. In 2024, 22% of Chicago's 11th graders can read at grade level. 19% are proficient at math. Now, I believe that anyone who supports a system that has that much money going into it, that gives those results, especially for lower income minority kids, anyone who does that is, I'm going to use the word evil, because what they're doing is destroying the lives and the opportunities of millions of people. And this is true in major cities all across the country, where the teachers' unions are electing the officials that determine what the rules are.
Well, it raises the question of whether people that support this are ignorant of what's really going on, and they indulge in a lot of wishful thinking about what should happen, or whether they know this and exploit it anyway.
Well, or you can be like Rahm Emanuel, where he wanted to do something but recognized that the political forces arrayed against him were so powerful that he couldn't get it done. And by the way, that is a fundamental concern of a system where people are where officials are elected by the people. And if one side, and let me say that then this will be a regular theme of ours, and it may upset some people, but I will stick with providing facts to support the conclusion. And anybody who wants to offer other facts, I'm open to facts changing my mind. For example, we talked earlier. I read the part in the Constitution
about the judiciary.
Yeah, that I said, well, I had it wrong.
Right.
So if somebody wants to provide me with information, facts, that'll cause me to change my mind, I'm open to it. But the government employee unions in this country, federal, state, and local, they have 7 to 8 million members who pay anywhere from $700 to $1,000 a year in dues, which generates between $5.5 and $7 billion a year in dues that is used to support their political agenda. And their political agenda for them is higher pay, higher benefits, and no accountability.
Yes.
That is their, and if you are a Democrat politician and you will not agree to those things, they will try to defeat you in the next Democrat primary.
Right.
Now, and there may be that lone person out there who defeated the Democrat machine in the Democrat primary. But notice I said that lone person, because the vast majority of elected Democrats at the state and local level are there because the government employee unions back them.
There's somebody that told me, and I'm wondering if you were involved in this conversation, that in California, if you want to be elected, you have to satisfy the public employee unions.
Yes.
CalPERS is their pension system, has a huge amount of money. They essentially will not support you unless you submit to this kind of priority.
That's the pension program. But California has 11% of the population of the United States. 24% of government employees who are members of a union are in California. 24%. And so they have the government employee unions have so much money in California that they can outspend any of their opponents, whether it's in the Democrat primary or the general election. They can outspend them 5 to 10 to 1. And mother's milk, money is the mother's milk of politics. And while a politician can win an election in a general election with less money than the opponent, they are at an inherent disadvantage going in.
Right.
And that is a real concern. So Michael, as we kind of look at, there are a couple of other issues that I wanted to get to that I think are kind of interesting.
Okay.
The other one on education is that technology on ways of teaching people to learn is improving at a record rate. I mean, it's incredible, and that's with these goggles and whatnot, where you can put the education, the curriculum in the goggles. There's different ways that
so it's experiential rather than sitting and listening and taking notes and to a lecture. You experience it, you touch it,
and so there are ways to learn, but it reduces the power of unions, and so being able to take advantage of the innovations in education will necessarily require either tremendous increases in school vouchers, where parents have choices, and therefore the market will compete. Educators who want to provide services will compete for that, and so I'm hopeful that if the educational choice movement continues to expand, I'm hopeful but there's this giant force pushing against that. But there are two other issues that I wanted to get to. One is there's an interesting tort law that's being passed in New York that's being pushed through by Letitia James. So I'm just going to read this from the article. It says, Georgia versus New York on torts. New York Attorney General Letitia James is pushing legislation that will let trial lawyers sue business over alleged, quote, unfair, deceptive, and abusive, unquote, practices without need of proving actual harm. So I want to read that quote again. Unfair, deceptive, and abusive practices. Now, if the theory is that no one is above the law, and that were to apply to politicians who are deceptive, can you imagine? That voters would get to sue politicians for not keeping their promises? And if no one is above the law, then it ought to apply. But what Letitia James is doing is the trial lawyers are a very powerful electoral group with money in New York, and she's trying to give lawyers the opportunity to sue even if nobody was harmed. And just think about the ramifications of that. It'd be just terrible. So I'm going
to sue you for what could have happened because of your bad ideas, because you're doing things I don't like.
Well, or you're trying to be deceptive and you didn't deceive anybody, but you're trying to be. So I'm going to sue you anyway. And by the way, I get to decide what I think is deceptive.
Sure.
Yeah. And so then a jury will decide. Right. And so Letitia James, I mean, this is the type of thing that will drive businesses out of New York and drive the cost of doing business in New York even higher, which hurts the average person. Georgia, by the way, the reason the article, Georgia's going exactly the opposite direction. Tennessee, we had tort reform about 10 years ago. Beth Harwell was the Speaker of the House, and she led the effort on tort reform. And she was a marvelous speaker. A lot of good things happened when she was Speaker of the House. And then
torts are a form of having to do with liability, right?
Yes.
A tort is a legal action to impose liability. Help me with that.
Yeah, well, it's to sue if you sue somebody because you've been wronged. Now, it used to be, and in New York it used to be, that you had to prove a financial damage. If I'm going to sue you for $10,000, I have to prove that I've been harmed by you
to the degree of
$10,000. And this law will say no, you tried to deceive me, and it didn't work.
But you're going to pay anyway.
You're going to pay anyway, and I get to decide whether or not what you said was tricky or not. Like if I'm a hamburger chain, I suppose, say the greatest hamburger on planet Earth.
Coldest beer on Earth. I've seen those signs.
Now I'd have to prove that my hamburger is greater than any hamburger on planet Earth.
This is obviously a recipe for a lot of more lawsuits.
Yes.
That's great for trial lawyers.
Yes. And
they're giving a lot of money to the people that are trying to put this rule in place.
And so this is part of the way our system works. Now, the other one I want to talk about, just very briefly, is that at Columbia University, the Trump administration said if you don't change these, it's either 8 or 9 policies. If you don't change every one of these, you're not going to get the $400 million that you've been getting. And
from the federal government,
from the federal government,
research and a bunch of different things.
A bunch of things. And the president of Columbia agreed to the terms. Okay, and then she held a private meeting, with 75 professors and administrators at Columbia, and the word is somebody was at the meeting and I think taped the meeting.
Yeah, I read that they couldn't turn off the recording aspect of Zoom.
It was Zoom. Yes, it was a Zoom meeting. You're right. So it was recorded. And she said that they weren't going to adhere to, they've agreed to it, but they weren't going to adhere to it.
Don't worry, we're not changing anything.
We're not changing anything. So now the question is, how do you hold that person accountable? How do you hold the board of Columbia accountable? These are, and you know, what is, and by the way, if people who are in those kinds of positions of power feel that they have the authority or the right even to the money to say whatever they need to say to get the money, but then they can still run things the way they want to, this is what elections are supposed to be about, is voters get to elect people who will then do what the voters want them to do.
You know, we talked about accountability earlier and dependency. You and I have started small businesses for most of our career. And before you become profitable, you're vulnerable because you've got to do what the next investor requires you to do, or else you just go out of business. Mm-hmm. That's the position that some of these universities are in because they have grown to be so dependent on government, they can't say no. Right, or the money gets withdrawn. So here again, the private sector has to be self-supporting and sustainable, to use a word that's very loved by the left. A private sector business is sustainable because it can pay its own bills.
Yes, and so it makes its own decisions, and if it doesn't please its customers, the people who actually pay for their services, then they'll go out of business. But in this case, the question is, if the government is telling you, you get the money as long as you agree to operate according to what we are telling you to do, and then you lie to the government to get the money, and then continue to do things contrary to that. The question is, where's the honesty? And this is regardless of what your opinions are. If you take the money, then you're required. You know, it's if you work for CNN or Fox, you still, what you say on the air can be affected by the management of the organization.
Sure, you're accountable to who employs you
because you're and
so one of the solutions here is just not take the money from people in the first place and let them do what they think best to do with it.
Or at the federal level, just say, we're not going to give you the money. You do what you want to do. We're not giving you the money.
Well, in the case of these universities, I'm saying before they even take the money from the taxpayer and then spend money to create rules and give back part of it to somebody, just cut it out. This is what some people are saying. Just give the education money back to the states, let them do what they think best with it, and cancel the Department of Education.
Right. Well,
because they've been in existence for 40 or 50 years, and things have gotten worse after spending trillions of dollars at that level. Yeah,
and therein lies, that'll be the debate that's held between now and the end of September, when the Congress will pass the budget for the next year.
Yes.
And there'll be a lot of the DOGE and a lot of the things that Trump is doing will either make it into that budget or won't make it into that budget. We'll see. Well, Michael, we'll go close up for today. We rambled around a good bit, but the major themes we wanted to hit on was the nature of government versus the nature of the private sector, and whether or not it's inherently efficient, whether it's inherently inefficient, and what that means in the greater scheme of things as we drive our car toward that cliff.
There's a lot of good people caught up in bad systems.
Yes.
And so it's important to make the point that there's a lot of very well-motivated and well-intentioned people in government that are doing good things, and some think they're doing good things. But
or would like to do good things and can't.
That's probably more likely than any of the rest.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.